Hi everyone online, my name is Oli Bliss, and today I'm here to talk to you about account takeover. And really the theme of today is going to be talking about weak passwords being the road to identity theft. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about account takeover. Now, I think it's fair to say that most of us have a fairly good notion of what account takeover can mean, but I think it's great for us to be able to provide a real-life example, because account takeover can be really complex, and there's a lot of unknowns around account takeover. So we want to be able to walk you through a very simple account takeover example, and really what the repercussions of that can be. Right, now let's start with a real-life example. So I want to tell you a story which actually has happened to one of my colleagues, a good friend of mine named Ansi. So Ansi has worked for F-Secure for close to 10 years now. Now, about a year and a half ago, it was a Saturday morning. Ansi was woken up by his 6-year-old son, Emily, early Saturday morning. And as was pretty typical on the weekends, Emily asked Ansi if he could go downstairs and turn on Netflix. He wanted to watch some Netflix. So, half asleep, Ansi said, yeah, go on downstairs, turn Netflix on, do your thing, let me sleep. So 6-year-old Emily goes downstairs, turns on the TV, and Ansi falls back asleep. Well, a couple minutes later, Ansi hears, Dad, Dad! And Ansi was like, okay, what, son? Emily said that, I can't access Netflix, Netflix isn't working. And Ansi was saying that, well, just turn it on, I'm sure it'll work. Emily insisted that Netflix wasn't working. So, reluctantly, Ansi gets out of bed, walks downstairs, goes over to the TV, and he sees a message on the screen saying that Netflix does not recognize his account login or password. Now, Ansi has been a subscriber of Netflix for years, so he wasn't able to access his Netflix account. Classic example of an account takeover. In this case, Ansi's account was actually hijacked, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why things like that happen. I really think this is an example that we can really relate to. If it hasn't happened to us ourselves, we probably know somebody who something like this has happened to before. Now, as mentioned, Ansi works for F-Secure, so he really wanted to get to the bottom of this. And he started thinking, how is it possible that his account was taken over? Well, after a bit of digging, it turns out that the password that he used at that time with Netflix was an old password that he had used with several other accounts years before. And after some further digging, it was apparent that a service that Ansi had used, some secondary service that he didn't even remember, the password he had used with that service had been part of a breach, and that same password, or a very close combination, was used with his Netflix account. So again, classic example of what can happen when we rely on weak and recycled passwords. Now, let's talk a little bit about why do these things like account takeover actually happen in the first place? Well, what we know actually is that the majority of end users risk their identity every single day. Now that might sound like a pretty bold statement, but when you look at the facts that 8 out of 10 users rely on weak passwords. So we end users are actually the weakest link in the chain. We're cemented into bad password habits. We're all guilty of using weak passwords, reusing passwords. Sometimes we think we're pretty clever and we like to add a 1, 2, 3 to the end, or maybe we throw in an exclamation mark. But at the end of the day, we are fundamentally relying on weak passwords. And this is a huge problem and one of the main drivers for things like account takeover. Now I want us to talk a little bit about the accounts that we use and logins that we have to create online. Think about this. Try accessing some company's service or buying a product online without having to give up some of your information or without having to create an account, log your information with some service provider. Pretty hard to do nowadays, right? Now, different services require different levels of information. So not all services require tons and tons of information about us end users. So we can sort of categorize different service providers. Some service providers, like, let's say you download an app to do your parking, or perhaps it's an app that you want to rate your beer or your wine. Typically, these will ask you to create an account, and they're asking for an email address, maybe sometimes a street address. In some cases, it might be a credit card if there's some sort of financial transactions behind the service. but most likely not a ton of information. But you're always forced to use an email address, most commonly, and a password of some shape and form. Now, move further down the line and you start accessing services which require a little bit more information about you as an end user. Say PayPal, they're going to want to know what your bank account number is. They're going to want to know what your credit card number is. And again, to access these services, while some service providers offer things like two-factor authentication, mostly always you have to log in with a username and a password. And another good example is I happen to be a MasterCard user, and I use one of their apps to follow my monthly transactions. Well, the main login identifier is actually my social security number, and that's tied to another password. So now we're in a scenario where we're relying on multiple tens, even hundreds of different services online, different accounts that we've created, and each account has a little bit of information about us. All right, so what does it actually mean that we have bits and pieces of information floating around online? Well, here's where I love to use a certain example, which we hear all the time. The average end user will feel that they really have nothing to hide. They might be using an app which is health-oriented or fitness-oriented, or maybe it's an app to rate wine or beer and so forth. Now, what we hear all the time is the end users saying that, well, I don't have any important information logged to that account, so even if that company or that service gets breached or hacked, so what? What are they going to do? How are they going to use my wine reviews against me? Now, this is a classic example which we love to use because, again, what is the common denominator across all these services? Passwords, right? So think of it this way. An end user is creating accounts with some sort of secondary service or app which has no relevance, so to say. They are using a weak password. Now, what if that same password is the same password that they use, for example, with their PayPal account? Or it could be a variation of that password that they're using with another service. The way most threat actors and online criminals work nowadays is that they really want to target the low-hanging fruit. This is why we see a lot of so-called secondary services being breached. Why? Well, because security isn't top of their mind. So typically these smaller organizations and companies are a way easier target than, for example, trying to hack into Facebook or breach PayPal. So quite often, online attackers will actually target these weak organizations because if they're able to get their hands on millions and millions of end users' user credentials, they can use these user credentials for something far greater. They're not interested in getting those wine reviews, or they're not interested in getting your parking meter details. They're interested in getting your plain text password combined with your email address and seeing which doors can they unlock with that combination. And by doors, I mean other services. So again, think about that scenario where we might be using the same or a similar password for a service which has a lot more personal information about me. And this is where we see account takeover really coming into play. Account takeover is designed to spread like fire. In Unsie's instance, he was unable to access his Netflix. What we don't know is what happened in the background. What other services were breached? What other services were taken over because of this same password problem? And this is exactly why we see things like full-blown identity theft. In most all cases, identity theft starts with account takeover. It could start with something as trivial as the Netflix case. And again, the reason why things like account takeover are so successful is because we use bad and weak passwords. We are the weakest link. So we really need to do something about this password problem, and it's not going to go away overnight. Right, so I feel we've now covered a very good example of how something as trivial as a secondary service being breached and your password being part of that, and how that can lead to things like account takeover, which then can actually lead to identity theft. So now would be a good time to talk about what is it that we can do about this? Okay, so referring back to my friend Ansi and his example of the Netflix account being taken over. Now what if Ansi had received a breach alert that his password that he's been using with this secondary site has been part of a breach and has been exposed. What if he had then changed his password in that service and realized that he's using that same password to log onto Netflix? What if he had changed his password with Netflix? His account wouldn't have been taken over. Such an easy solution. The problem, obviously, is that Ansi was never aware that his information was part of a breach in the first place, so he had no reason to change his password. What we want to be able to do is stop account takeover dead in its tracks. We can do that by making sure that we're alerting end users when their personal information is being abused, when it's been part of a breach, when it's been exposed, and so forth. Now again, had Ansi had visibility into his personal information being breached, he could have done something about it. Okay, so let's look at this from a different angle. What if there was no alert about the breach in the first place, but Ansi had been using something like a password manager, which he should have been using in the first place. But if he had been using a password manager and wasn't relying on weak passwords by nature, he most likely wouldn't have fallen victim to account takeover because he would have had a strong and unique password with each and every single account. And that's the beauty of a password manager. It does all that legwork for you. So, what if we were to have a scenario of having strong passwords and alerts about breaches? I think we'd be in a pretty good position to be able to stop account takeover dead in its tracks. All right, my name is Oli Bliss. Thank you for attending my session and enjoy the rest of the webinar.